There's a kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, a weariness that penetrates so deep into your bones that you wake up feeling like you've been carrying stones in your chest all night long. You look in the mirror and see someone who appears functional on the outside, but inside there's a heaviness you can't name, a fatigue that has nothing to do with how many hours you worked yesterday or how little rest you got last night. This isn't the tiredness that comes from physical exertion or even mental strain. This is something else entirely. This is the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying emotional weight you've never fully understood, pain that has been living inside you for so long that you've forgotten it doesn't belong there. You've been walking through life with invisible burdens strapped to your back, wondering why every step feels so difficult, why happiness feels so fleeting, why peace seems always just out of reach. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon better than perhaps any psychologist before or since. He recognized that within each of us lies what he called the personal unconscious, a vast repository of experiences, emotions, and memories that we've pushed down, pushed away, or simply never had the tools to process. These aren't just forgotten memories. They're living, breathing parts of our psyche that continue to influence every decision we make, every relationship we form, and every emotion we feel. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This pain you're carrying isn't your enemy. It's not a sign that you're broken or damaged beyond repair. It's actually your psyche's way of trying to communicate with you, to show you parts of yourself that are desperately seeking integration and understanding. The exhaustion you feel isn't just from carrying the pain. It's from the enormous amount of energy it takes to keep these parts of yourself unconscious, to maintain the walls you've built, to avoid feeling what needs to be felt. Today, we're going to explore why you're so tired, not just on the surface level, but at the deepest core of your being. We're going to understand how unprocessed pain creates a constant drain on your life force, and more importantly, we're going to discover how recognizing and integrating this pain can finally free you from the exhaustion that has been stealing your vitality for far too long. The architecture of emotional exhaustion. Jung spent his entire career mapping the landscape of the human psyche, and what he discovered was both revolutionary and deeply practical. He found that the mind isn't just a single, unified entity, but rather a complex system of different parts, different voices, different aspects of self that are constantly interacting below the surface of consciousness. Think of your psyche as an iceberg, the small tip that you see above water, your conscious thoughts, your daily awareness, your rational mind. This represents only a tiny fraction of what's actually there. Below the surface lies the vast expanse of your unconscious mind, where all the experiences you couldn't process, all the emotions you couldn't handle, all the parts of yourself you couldn't accept, continue to exist and exert their influence. Modern neuroscience has validated Jung's insights in remarkable ways. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research on trauma shows us that unprocessed emotional experiences don't simply fade away with time. They become stored in what he calls body memory, creating persistent patterns of tension, hypervigilance, and emotional reactivity that can last for decades. When you carry pain you don't understand, your nervous system remains in a constant state of low-level activation, always scanning for threats, always ready to protect you from dangers that may no longer exist in your current reality. This is why you feel so tired. Your system is working overtime to manage emotions and experiences that never got properly processed. It's like having multiple programs running in the background of your computer, slowing everything down, draining the battery, making even simple tasks feel overwhelmingly difficult. Jung called these unprocessed experiences complexes, autonomous clusters of thoughts, emotions, and memories that can take over your consciousness without warning. You might be having a perfectly normal conversation when suddenly someone says something that triggers one of these complexes, and you find yourself flooded with emotions that seem completely disproportionate to the situation. You might feel embarrassed by your reaction, confused by the intensity of your feelings, but what you're actually experiencing is the activation of old pain that never had the chance to be understood and integrated. The exhaustion comes from the constant internal conflict between these different parts of yourself. One part of you wants to move forward, to be happy, to create meaningful relationships and pursue your dreams. But another part, the part that carries the unprocessed pain, is stuck in the past, still trying to protect you from hurts that happened years or even decades ago. This internal tug-of-war is extraordinarily draining and it happens largely outside of your conscious awareness. What makes this even more complex is that we live in a culture that actively discourages deep emotional processing. We're taught to move on, to get over it, to stay positive. We're given the message that examining our pain is self-indulgent, that healing is a luxury we can't afford. So we learn to function despite the pain, to achieve and succeed and appear normal while carrying these invisible burdens that grow heavier with each passing year. But Jung understood something crucial. What we don't make conscious inevitably controls us from the unconscious. The pain you don't understand doesn't disappear. It shapes your choices, influences your relationships, and creates patterns of self-sabotage that can persist throughout your entire life. The tiredness you feel is your psyche's way of saying, pay attention, there's something here that needs your care. The shadow of unprocessed pain. One of Jung's most profound contributions to psychology was his understanding of what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we've rejected, denied, or pushed into the unconscious because they were too threatening, too painful, or too incompatible with the image we wanted to maintain of ourselves. When it comes to unprocessed pain, the shadow often contains our most vulnerable emotions, our grief, our rage, our terror, our desperate need for love and acceptance. These emotions, when they first arose, may have felt too dangerous to experience fully. Perhaps you learned early in life that showing sadness made others uncomfortable, so you pushed your grief into the shadow. Perhaps expressing anger led to punishment or rejection, so your rage went underground. Perhaps your need for comfort and nurturing was met with dismissal or shame, so you learned to deny these fundamental human needs. But here's what Jung discovered. The shadow doesn't just contain our negative emotions. It also holds our vitality, our authenticity, our creative power, all the parts of ourselves that we sacrificed in order to be accepted, to fit in, to survive in environments that couldn't hold the fullness of who we were. When you push pain into the shadow, you often end up pushing away parts of your aliveness along with it. This is why so many people describe feeling numb or empty, even when their lives look successful from the outside. They've been so busy avoiding their pain that they've also cut themselves off from their capacity for joy, for passion, for deep connection. The effort it takes to keep the shadow contained is enormous, and it leaves very little energy available for actually living. Dr. Gabor Mate's research on trauma and addiction reveals how this dynamic plays out in real life. He found that people often develop addictive behaviors not because they're seeking pleasure, but because they're trying to manage pain they can't consciously access or understand. Whether it's workaholism, perfectionism, people-pleasing, or more obvious addictions to substances or behaviors, these patterns often represent unconscious attempts to regulate emotions that were never properly processed. The exhaustion you feel may be your system's way of slowing you down enough to finally pay attention to what's been living in your shadow. Jung believed that symptoms, including chronic fatigue, depression, and anxiety, often arise when the unconscious is trying to get the conscious mind's attention. Your tiredness might not be something to fight against, but rather something to listen to, a signal that parts of you are ready to be acknowledged and integrated. Shadow work, the process of consciously engaging with these rejected parts of yourself, requires tremendous courage. It means being willing to feel emotions you've been avoiding, to examine beliefs about yourself that may be painful, to sit with aspects of your experience that you've learned to judge as unacceptable. But Jung found that this process, while difficult, is also deeply liberating. When you stop using energy to keep parts of yourself unconscious, that energy becomes available for creativity, for growth, for genuine intimacy with yourself and others. The goal isn't to eliminate the shadow or to become perfectly comfortable with all aspects of yourself. The goal is integration, learning to hold space for the full spectrum of your human experience without being overwhelmed by it or controlled by it. This means developing what Jung called conscious suffering, the ability to feel your pain fully while maintaining enough awareness to learn from it and eventually transform it. The personal unconscious and inherited pain. Jung made another revolutionary discovery that has profound implications for understanding why you might be carrying pain you never understood. He found that we don't just inherit our parents' eye color and height, we also inherit their unprocessed emotional patterns, their traumas, their ways of coping with the world. He called this the family unconscious, the emotional legacy that gets passed down through generations, often without anyone being consciously aware of it. The depression your grandmother never acknowledged, the rage your father learned to swallow, the terror your mother carried from her childhood, all of this can become part of your psychological inheritance, shaping your emotional landscape in ways you might never have considered. Modern research in epigenetics has provided scientific validation for Jung's insights. Dr. Rachel Yehuda's studies on Holocaust survivors and their children revealed that trauma can actually alter gene expression, and these changes can be passed down to future generations. The pain of ancestors can literally become encoded in our biology, creating predispositions to anxiety, depression, and other emotional difficulties that seem to come from nowhere. This means that some of the exhaustion you feel might not even originate from your own direct experiences. You might be carrying emotional burdens that belong to your family lineage, trying to process pain that was never fully felt or integrated by previous generations. This can create a particularly confusing form of suffering. You feel the weight of something significant, but you can't quite identify what it is or where it came from. Jung observed that when one person in a family system does the work of consciousness, when they begin to understand and integrate previously unconscious material, it can have a healing effect that ripples both forward and backward through the generations. By becoming conscious of the pain you carry, you're not just healing yourself, you're potentially breaking cycles that may have persisted in your family for generations. This perspective can be both sobering and liberating. It's sobering because it means you might be dealing with more than just your own personal struggles, but it's liberating because it means that your personal healing work has significance beyond your individual life. It's a form of service to your entire lineage. Dr. Mark Wallin's research on inherited family trauma shows that many people who struggle with seemingly inexplicable emotional patterns find relief when they begin to understand their family's emotional history. The anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere might be connected to your great-grandfather's experience in war. The deep sadness you've carried might be linked to losses that your family never properly grieved. The chronic feeling of not being safe might be related to historical traumas that were never acknowledged or processed. Understanding this doesn't mean blaming your family or becoming a victim of generational patterns. It means recognizing that you have the power to transform inherited pain through consciousness and compassion. When you begin to understand the pain you carry, both your own and what you may have inherited, you create the possibility of healing not just yourself, but entire family lines. The complexes that run your life. Jung's concept of complexes provides one of the most practical frameworks for understanding how unprocessed pain continues to influence your daily life. A complex is like an autonomous subpersonality within your psyche, a cluster of related thoughts, emotions, memories, and behaviors that can take over your consciousness when triggered. Think of complexes as internal programs that run automatically when certain conditions are met. You might have a rejection complex that gets activated whenever you feel like someone is pulling away from you, causing you to either desperately cling or preemptively withdraw. You might have an inadequacy complex that floods you with shame and self-criticism whenever you make a mistake or face a challenge. You might have an abandonment complex that makes it almost impossible for you to trust that people will stay in your life. These complexes aren't just psychological theories, they have real measurable effects on your nervous system. When a complex gets activated, your body floods with stress hormones, your breathing becomes shallow, your heart rate increases, and your capacity for rational thought decreases. You're literally hijacked by an emotional state that may have very little to do with your current circumstances and everything to do with unprocessed pain from your past. The exhaustion you feel often comes from the aftermath of these complex activations. Your nervous system is designed to handle occasional bursts of intense activation, but when you're dealing with unprocessed pain, you may find yourself being triggered multiple times a day. Each activation takes a toll on your system, and the recovery time gets longer and longer. Dr. Pete Walker's research on complex PTSD reveals how childhood trauma can create what he calls emotional flashbacks, sudden floods of intense emotion that seem to come from nowhere, but are actually the activation of trauma-based complexes. Unlike memory flashbacks, emotional flashbacks don't necessarily include visual memories of past events. Instead, you suddenly find yourself overwhelmed by feelings of terror, rage, shame, or despair that feel completely disproportionate to your current situation. What makes complexes particularly challenging is that they often contain both the wound and the protection. The same complex that floods you with abandonment terror also kicks in protective mechanisms designed to prevent abandonment, perhaps by making you hypervigilant to signs of rejection or by causing you to push people away before they can leave you. The complex that carries your shame about inadequacy might also drive you to perfectionism or workaholism as a way of proving your worth. Jung found that complexes can't be eliminated or cured in the traditional sense. They're not diseases to be treated, but rather parts of your psyche that need to be understood and integrated. The goal isn't to get rid of your complexes, but to develop a conscious relationship with them, to recognize when they're being activated, and to respond from your adult self rather than being completely taken over by them. This process begins with recognition. Learning to identify when you're in the grip of a complex is the first step toward freedom from its unconscious control. You might notice certain physical sensations, a tightness in your chest, a knot in your stomach, a sudden heaviness in your limbs. You might recognize certain thought patterns, catastrophic thinking, self-attack, projecting negative intentions onto others. You might observe certain behavioral impulses, the urge to flee, to fight, to freeze, to frantically try to fix or control something. Once you can recognize when a complex is activated, you can begin to create space between the complex and your conscious response. Instead of being completely identified with the emotions the complex generates, you can observe them with curiosity and compassion. Instead of automatically acting on the complex's urgency, you can pause and ask yourself, what is this really about? What part of me is hurting right now? What does this complex need from me? The body's memory of unprocessed pain. One of the most important developments in our understanding of trauma and unprocessed emotional pain is the recognition that the body keeps score. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking research reveals that traumatic experiences don't just create psychological symptoms, they become encoded in the body itself, creating patterns of tension, inflammation, and dysregulation that can persist for decades. When you experience something overwhelming, whether it's a single traumatic event or the accumulated stress of growing up in an emotionally challenging environment, your nervous system tries to process and integrate the experience. But sometimes the experience is too much, too fast, or happens at a time when you don't have the resources to cope. When this happens, the experience gets stuck in your system, continuing to influence your physiology long after the original event has passed. This is why unprocessed pain doesn't just create emotional symptoms. It can also manifest as chronic fatigue, digestive issues, autoimmune problems, chronic pain, and a host of other physical symptoms that seem to have no clear medical cause. Your body is holding the emotional charge of experiences that never got fully processed, and this creates a constant drain on your system. Jung intuited this mind-body connection long before modern neuroscience could explain it. He observed that psychological symptoms often had physical correlates, and that true healing required attention to both the emotional and somatic dimensions of experience. He developed techniques like active imagination, partially because he recognized that purely cognitive approaches to healing often weren't sufficient. The body needed to be included in the process. Dr. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work has shown that trauma recovery often requires helping the nervous system complete the biological responses that were interrupted during the original overwhelming experience. When you're in danger, your body naturally mobilizes energy for fight or flight. But if you couldn't fight or flee, if you were too small, too powerless, or if the danger came from someone you depended on, that mobilized energy can get trapped in your system. This trapped energy is part of what creates the chronic exhaustion you feel. Your nervous system is stuck in an incomplete cycle, holding patterns of activation that were never allowed to reach their natural conclusion. It's like having a car with the accelerator and the brake pressed simultaneously. Tremendous energy is being expended, but you're not actually going anywhere. The good news is that the same neuroplasticity that allows traumatic patterns to become encoded in your system also allows for healing and transformation. When you begin to work with your nervous system consciously through breathwork, movement, mindfulness practices, or somatic therapies, you can help complete these interrupted cycles and release the energy that's been bound up in maintaining defensive patterns. Jung's concept of active imagination can be particularly helpful in this process. By consciously engaging with the images, sensations, and impulses that arise from your unconscious, you create opportunities for stuck energy to move and transform. You might find yourself spontaneously shaking, crying, or moving in ways that help discharge old activation. You might have dreams or fantasies that help your psyche process experiences that were too overwhelming to integrate at the time they occurred. Understanding the somatic dimension of unprocessed pain helps explain why purely cognitive approaches to healing often fall short. You can understand intellectually why you feel the way you feel. You can trace your patterns back to their origins. You can develop sophisticated insights about your psychological dynamics. But if the pain is still held in your body, you'll continue to feel exhausted and overwhelmed. True healing requires what Jung called a union of opposites, bringing together the analytical and the experiential, the conscious and the unconscious, the mental and the physical. It requires developing the capacity to feel your emotions in your body while maintaining enough conscious awareness to learn from them and gradually transform them. The collective unconscious and universal suffering. Jung's most profound and controversial insight was his discovery of what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that contains not just personal memories and experiences, but universal human patterns, archetypal images, and shared emotional themes that appear across all cultures and historical periods. This means that some of the pain you carry isn't just personal or even familial. It's part of the human condition itself, the grief of separation, the terror of annihilation, the longing for connection, the fear of abandonment. These are universal human experiences that echo through every individual psyche. When you feel overwhelmed by sadness or fear or rage that seems to have no clear personal origin, you might be touching something deeper than your individual story. This perspective can be both overwhelming and profoundly comforting. It's overwhelming because it suggests that the pain you feel is connected to the suffering of all humanity, the wars, the losses, the traumas that have accumulated over millennia of human existence. But it's comforting because it means you're not alone in your suffering, that your pain connects you to something larger than your individual experience. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, in her work on feminine psychology, describes how many women carry what she calls the pain of the world, a deep sensitivity to collective suffering that can manifest as depression, anxiety, or a sense of being overwhelmed by life itself. This isn't pathology, it's a form of psychological sensitivity that allows certain individuals to feel and potentially transform collective emotional patterns. Jung believed that highly sensitive individuals often serve as what he called containers for collective unconscious material. They feel more deeply, suffer more intensely, and often struggle more with emotional overwhelm, not because they're personally more damaged, but because they're unconsciously processing emotional material that belongs to the larger human community. This understanding can radically shift how you relate to your pain and exhaustion. Instead of seeing your suffering as evidence of personal failure or weakness, you can begin to understand it as a form of service. You're feeling things that need to be felt, processing experiences that need to be processed, not just for yourself, but for the collective healing of humanity. Carl Jung himself struggled with periods of intense psychological upheaval, including what he later recognized as a necessary encounter with the collective unconscious. He found that his personal healing work had implications far beyond his individual life. It contributed to his understanding of universal psychological patterns that could help countless others understand their own inner struggles. This doesn't mean glorifying suffering or believing that pain is somehow noble or necessary. It means recognizing that your willingness to feel deeply, to examine your inner world, to do the difficult work of consciousness, creates ripple effects that extend far beyond your personal life. When you heal patterns of unprocessed pain within yourself, you're contributing to the healing of those same patterns in the collective unconscious. Dr. Joanna Macy's work on the Great Turning describes how individual psychological healing and planetary healing are intimately connected. The same mechanisms that create personal trauma, disconnection, denial, the numbing of natural responses, are at work on a collective level in how humanity relates to environmental destruction, social injustice, and other large-scale crises. When you develop the capacity to feel and process difficult emotions consciously, You're developing skills that are desperately needed for collective transformation. This perspective can help transform your relationship to your own pain and exhaustion. Instead of seeing them as problems to be fixed or weaknesses to be overcome, you can begin to understand them as invitations to develop greater emotional capacity, deeper compassion, and more conscious ways of relating to suffering, both your own and that of others. The path to integration and healing. Understanding the nature of unprocessed pain is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when you begin the practical work of integration, learning to consciously relate to the parts of yourself that have been unconscious, developing new ways of responding to emotional activation, and gradually building the capacity to hold space for your full emotional experience without being overwhelmed by it. Jung called this process individuation, the journey toward becoming consciously whole. This isn't about achieving perfection or eliminating all emotional difficulty. It's about developing a conscious relationship with all aspects of yourself, including the wounded, vulnerable, and previously rejected parts. The first step in this process is developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to stay present with difficult emotions without immediately trying to escape, fix, or change them. This is counterintuitive for most people because we've been conditioned to believe that the goal is to feel good as much as possible and to avoid pain at all costs. But Jung understood that consciousness requires the ability to hold paradox, to contain opposing forces without being torn apart by them. You can feel grief and gratitude simultaneously. You can be angry and loving at the same time. You can experience fear and courage as complementary rather than contradictory emotions. This capacity to hold complexity is what allows healing to occur. Dr. Tara Brach's concept of radical acceptance provides a practical framework for this kind of emotional integration. Radical acceptance doesn't mean liking everything you feel or being passive about circumstances that need to change. It means saying yes to whatever is arising in your experience right now, recognizing that resistance to what's already present only creates additional suffering. When you feel the activation of an old complex, instead of immediately trying to push it away or figure out how to fix it, you can practice simply being with it. You can notice where you feel it in your body, what images or memories might be associated with it, what this part of you seems to need. You can offer it the same kind of gentle, curious attention you might give to a frightened animal, present, patient, non-threatening. Active imagination, one of Jung's most powerful therapeutic techniques, can be particularly helpful in this process. This involves consciously engaging with the images, figures, and scenarios that emerge from your unconscious, allowing them to unfold without trying to control or direct them. You might find yourself in dialogue with different aspects of your personality, witnessing symbolic dramas that illuminate unconscious patterns, or receiving guidance from deeper parts of your psyche. The goal isn't to eliminate the complexes or heal all the wounds, but to develop a more conscious relationship with them. When you can recognize a complex being activated, you have choice about how to respond. When you understand the deeper needs that drive seemingly self-destructive patterns, you can begin to meet those needs in healthier ways. This process requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to resolve everything quickly or find simple answers to complex emotional situations, you learn to sit in the uncertainty, to let contradictory feelings coexist, to allow the psyche's own healing intelligence to work without interference from your analytical mind. Integration also requires developing new neural pathways through conscious practice. Every time you choose to stay present with a difficult emotion, rather than dissociating from it, you're strengthening your capacity for emotional regulation. Every time you respond to your own suffering with compassion rather than criticism, you're rewiring patterns that may have been established in childhood. This isn't a linear process, and it doesn't happen quickly. There will be setbacks, periods of regression, times when old patterns feel stronger than your conscious efforts to change them. But Jung understood that psychological development follows what he called a spiral pattern. You return to the same issues again and again, but each time from a slightly higher level of consciousness and integration. The transformation of exhaustion into vitality. As you begin to understand and integrate the pain you've been carrying, something remarkable begins to happen. The energy that was bound up in keeping painful experiences unconscious becomes available for living. The exhaustion that seemed so overwhelming begins to lift, Not because you've eliminated all difficulty from your life, but because you're no longer fighting against yourself. Jung observed that symptoms often contain their own cure. The depression that feels so heavy might be your psyche's way of slowing you down enough to pay attention to what needs healing. The anxiety that seems so disruptive might be activation energy that can be transformed into creativity and passion once you understand what it's really about. The rage that feels so destructive might be life force that's been twisted by trauma, but can be reclaimed and channeled constructively. This doesn't mean romanticizing suffering or believing that all pain has a higher purpose. It means recognizing that your psyche has its own intelligence, its own healing capacity, and that symptoms often arise when unconscious material is ready to be integrated into consciousness. Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes describes this transformation through the metaphor of composting, taking the raw material of your experiences, even the difficult and painful ones, and allowing them to decompose and transform into fertile soil for new growth. The pain doesn't disappear, but it becomes integrated into a larger sense of wholeness and wisdom. As you develop the capacity to stay present with difficult emotions, you also develop greater capacity for positive emotions. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to suffering also allows you to experience joy, love, and beauty more deeply. The emotional range that trauma may have compressed begins to expand in both directions. Many people report that as they do this integration work, they begin to experience what Jung called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggest a deeper order and intelligence at work in their lives. They find themselves in the right place at the right time, meeting people who can support their healing, discovering resources and opportunities that align with their growing sense of authentic purpose. This isn't magical thinking, it's the natural result of becoming more conscious and integrated. When you're not spending so much energy managing unconscious complexes and defensive patterns, you become more present, more aware of subtle cues and opportunities, more able to act from your authentic desires rather than from fear and compensation. The vitality that emerges from integration work is different from the energy that comes from avoiding pain or forcing positivity. It's a more sustainable, grounded kind of aliveness that can handle both joy and sorrow, success and failure, connection and solitude. It's what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension and allow something new to emerge from their interaction. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it's not a destination you reach once and then maintain effortlessly. It's an ongoing process of deepening consciousness, expanding compassion, and developing greater capacity for life in all its complexity. But once you begin to taste this kind of integrated vitality, the exhaustion of carrying unconscious pain begins to feel like an old dream from which you're finally awakening. Living from wholeness. The ultimate goal of Jung's approach to healing isn't to eliminate all pain or achieve some state of perpetual happiness. It's to live from wholeness, to be able to access all parts of yourself as needed, to respond to life's challenges with flexibility and resilience, to create meaning from both your suffering and your joy. When you're living from wholeness, you no longer need to split yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You can acknowledge your anger without being consumed by it, feel your sadness without being overwhelmed by it, experience your fear without being paralyzed by it. You can also fully embrace your joy, your creativity, your love and your dreams without the unconscious sabotage that comes from unintegrated shadow material. This wholeness isn't a static state. It's a dynamic process of ongoing integration and growth. New challenges will continue to activate old complexes. Life will continue to present you with experiences that push you beyond your comfort zone, and parts of your unconscious will continue to emerge into consciousness throughout your lifetime. But once you understand the process, once you know how to recognize when you're being triggered by unprocessed pain, once you've developed tools for staying present with difficult emotions, once you've learned to respond to your own suffering with compassion rather than resistance, you have a foundation for navigating whatever life brings with greater wisdom and resilience. Jung believed that this work of individual integration contributes to the evolution of collective consciousness. When you stop projecting your unconscious material onto others, you create more space for authentic relationship. When you take responsibility for your own emotional patterns, you stop unconsciously perpetuating cycles of harm. When you transform your pain into wisdom, You become a resource for others who are struggling with similar challenges. Living from wholeness means accepting that you're human, that you'll continue to make mistakes, that you'll never be perfect or completely free from emotional difficulty. But it also means trusting in your capacity to learn from your experiences, to grow through your challenges, to find meaning in both your suffering and your joy. The exhaustion you've been carrying begins to transform into a deep, sustainable vitality, not the manic energy of avoiding pain, but the grounded aliveness that comes from being fully present to your own experience. You stop needing to be anyone other than who you are, stop needing to fix yourself or achieve some ideal state of being, and start living from the magnificent complexity of your authentic self. This is Jung's gift to humanity, the recognition that our wounds, when consciously engaged, become gateways to wisdom, that our pain, when understood and integrated, becomes a source of compassion, that our exhaustion, when listened to, becomes an invitation to come home to ourselves in a deeper way than we ever imagined possible. Your tiredness has been trying to tell you something important. It's been calling you to pay attention to parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently in the shadows for recognition and integration. The pain you've been carrying without understanding is actually your own unlived life, your own rejected aspects, your own untapped potential for wholeness and authentic vitality. The journey toward understanding and integrating this pain isn't easy, but it's the most important work you'll ever do. It's the work of reclaiming yourself, of coming home to the fullness of who you are, of transforming the lead of unconscious suffering into the gold of conscious wisdom and compassion. You don't have to carry this pain forever. You don't have to remain exhausted by wounds you don't understand. The path to integration and healing is available to you right now in this moment, through your willingness to turn toward yourself with curiosity and compassion, to listen to what your symptoms are trying to tell you, and to embrace the magnificent complexity of your human experience. This is how you stop being tired, not by avoiding your pain, but by finally understanding it, integrating it, and allowing it to transform into the wisdom and vitality that have been waiting within you all along.